Welcome again, everyone. Fantastic to have you here. A great turnout for this webinar. We had about 180 people sign up and people are still trickling in. And it looks like a really good turnout. So I'm really pleased to have you all with us this morning virtually. Warm welcome to everyone. Election results still trickling in on local government. I'm sure many of us are keeping one eye on the social media or on the TV screen and the other eye on the webinar, because it's very interesting times with election results coming in, also in the Western Cape, with what seems to be a large number of hung councils. So very challenging times for local governance ahead, I think, is the theme this morning. So of course, the incoming councillors are going to be very excited to be at the helm of municipalities, but what is it that they have to work with? What is the funding basis on which this new political leadership will have to work to deliver services and facilitate development in municipalities? And that's the theme for this morning. So great to have you here with us. We convened this webinar to talk about the fiscal framework for local government. Before I do so, just, the usual rules apply for these webinars. Try to keep your microphone on mute if you're not speaking. It's probably also best to keep your camera off just to save bandwidth. And if you have any comments, use the chat box for the duration of the inputs. And if we have time after the scheduled speakers, we'll see if we can make some time available for a question and answer session, possibly also using verbal inputs. But let's see how we proceed. A big thank you to everyone who joined. Big thank you also to our funders, the Hanns Seidel Foundation. I see they are in the room. Welcome, Ms. Barnard, Marlene Barnard, who has been instrumental in also helping us with this project. So a warm welcome to all of you. What we want to discuss this morning is the fiscal framework for local government, and we're really doing this in partnership with the Stellenbosch School of Public Leadership, who has been doing fantastic research under the leadership of Professor Ajam, looking at various aspects of the fiscal framework for local government, financial management in municipalities, the impact of COVID-19, the regulatory burden, and you'll find a set of fantastic articles summarizing that research in the local government bulletin. We want to pick on a few themes this morning, looking specifically at the local government equitable share and the local government fiscal framework. And we really have, I think, a fantastic lineup to discuss this. I'm really proud of the panel that we have this morning. Professor Ajam herself is here to present her research, and I can go on and on about the bells and whistles and the accolades for Professor Ajam. She's professor at the School of Public Leadership in Stellenbosch, former commissioner of the Financial and Fiscal Commission, a member of the Presidential Advisory Commission on the economic state of affairs of the country, many other roles that she plays, and she is an excellent academic practitioner in local government. So very proud to have her here in this webinar with us. Welcome, welcome, Tania. And she will be joined by Stephen Kenyon, who is Chief Director of Public Finance in the Western Cape Department of Local Government, someone who has a very deep history in the fiscal framework for local government, formerly with the National Treasury. Really someone, we couldn't have found a better person to engage us and Professor Ajam on the research that has been done. So thanks upfront to the two colleagues for joining us, and we really look forward to this discussion. So please check the bulletin articles, local government bulletin online. We'll post a link in the chat box again if you want to read up while we're talking. We'll also post an evaluation form in the chat box, so please fill that out if you don't mind. It's just 2 or 3 questions to to keep us appraised of what you think of these webinars and how we can improve on them. The format will be quite simple. I will ask Tania to present her research, and after that we'll look forward to a response from Stephen. I have a sense that they will agree on many things and that they may disagree on some things, and that's also what we look forward to, because these things are complex and there are always many angles to the discussion. So we look forward to that. Colleagues from the media, if you are in the virtual room with us, fantastic, and feel free to report on what we're discussing. But if you want to quote any of us that are presenting or talking, please have the courtesy just to check with that person afterwards if it's okay. I hope you can extend that courtesy to us. We want to have a free and open conversation about a complex and contentious issue. It'd be great if you report on it, but please extend us the courtesy of checking with us, with the respondents, or if you want to quote us in your article. So I hope we can work on that format. So again, warm welcome and thanks for joining us. And Tania, I see that you are ready. I hope you are ready, and we go over to you. Welcome, good morning, and over to you, Tania.
Good morning, Jaap, and everybody who's joined us. I want to acknowledge that there are a number of very eminent public finance scholars and practitioners in the audience. You know, we have people like Dr. Batan Vasiswana, we have people like Philip van Reineveld, we have colleagues from the FFC, National Treasury, and so I'm very grateful. I look forward to hearing their views. And what I'll try and do is to just make a few remarks to kick off the discussion. But what I'm really hoping for is that we try and get as much audience participation as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen now. Yeah, please just let me know when it becomes visible.
Not yet.
Let me. Can you guys see it?
No, we're seeing a picture of you, but
okay, let me try again. Let's try and share the screen again.
Yeah, there we go. All good.
Okay, awesome. So I think that one of the reasons why we've got such a good turnout is that local government is top of mind for all of us. And post-election, as Jaap has pointed out, this discussion is very timely. We're seeing some interesting emerging trends happening, the increased presence of coalition governance, and that has implications for the stability of the political administrative interface, and as a knock-on effect to finances as well. We're also seeing extremely low voter turnout and questions of legitimacy. So within that context, it becomes critical that we start interrogating some of those issues. And I think that, you know, when you look at local government, it's no secret that for the last couple of decades, there have been concerns about both the financial and the operational sustainability of municipalities within the sphere. And those include deep structural issues, you know, including, for example, load shedding, which have recently been exacerbated by the pandemic. So when you look at the sphere, it's important to recognize that the financial, the operational, and governance factors are inextricably intertwined. And that brings me to a comment that Michael Sachs always makes. He always says that finance is actually not the fundamental problem, and it's also not the fundamental solution. And I endorse that view. Nevertheless, finances are important, and you know, it's important for us to reflect on them. Before I go on to make the substance of my comments, I just want to talk very briefly about the study that gave rise to this, we were looking at the issue of fiscal sustainability within Western Cape municipalities. And we found that while there was quite a lot of resilience in the short term, in terms of financial sustainability, even given the pandemic, longer term concerns about the sustainability of municipalities remained. And so, I have to say that because municipalities have such different contexts, a lot of what I say, obviously colored by the Western Cape lens, might not apply. However, to the extent that some of these factors are built into the design of the intergovernmental fiscal system, they might well have relevance beyond the sample under study. And what makes the Western Cape interesting to study from an academic perspective is that, if you look at levels of reported corruption, if you look at inefficiency and waste, those are lower in the Western Cape than in other provinces. And what this means is that you can then focus on the structural issues a lot more, with a lot more clarity. So to just point out that we looked at 8 local municipalities in the Western Cape, larger ones like Stellenbosch, Drakenstein, medium like Bergrivier, Issaquah, Swartland, small ones like Swellendam, Kannaland, and Laingsburg. We also looked at 3 district municipalities and the metro, etc., just to give you some idea of the sample that we were looking at. But I think that it's important to also look at more recent studies that have looked at a broader range of municipalities to kind of get a sense of the sphere as a whole. And one such recent study is the Out of Order Index by News 24. Their coverage included 200 local municipalities and 8 metros. And they developed an index. You can see the URL to the index if you haven't seen it and you're interested in looking at it in more detail. But what this index does, it ranges between 0 and 100, where 0 is classified as a failure and 100 as perfectly performing. So to compile this index, they draw on a number of factors, around about 20 factors, not only financial, but also unemployment, poverty, basic service delivery, etc. And by and large, the data sources that are used in the index are official data sources like National Treasury's budget data, Auditor General's reports, and Statistics South Africa. And one of the key findings that they find is that the national average of these 208 odd municipalities is 45 out of 100, right? So given that, 50% is just basically kind of scraping through, this is actually quite a concerning indictment on the sphere as a whole. And then what they did was they also looked at the score for municipalities that had previously been identified either by the AG or by COGTA as being at risk. And those included about 105 municipalities. And they found that the average score there was 43 out of 100. So the municipalities that are identified as being high risk are having scores which are not much worse than for the average sample. And this index also looked at a number of years. So it was also time series data. And what they found is that there appeared to be stagnation, that this situation had not really changed much in the last 3 years. And in addition to the municipalities that had already been identified as being at risk, the index identified another 43 municipalities which had not been named as being dysfunctional, but did actually score lower on average than the known problematic municipalities. And those 43 municipalities, which were additionally identified by the index, were drawn from 6 provinces: KwaZulu-Natal in the main, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Northern Cape, and Northwest. And so I just want to give a quick summary of what the out-of-index scores were. On the vertical axis, you can see the index scores by the various municipalities. What you notice is that, above 56%, 61 to 65, 56 to 60, very few municipalities there in the well-performing category, only about 26 of them. But if you look at below the average, which is about 45 and below, you can see the bulk is basically clustered there. They also looked at a couple of indicators. For instance, they looked at the percentage of the personnel budget as a percentage of operating expenditures. And you can see a list of the highest provinces, highest municipalities, or municipalities where personnel formed a greater percentage of operating revenue. The highest one was in Pendley. That ratio is 143%. That doesn't make sense. I don't know how you can spend 143% on your budget. And I think that might just be an artifact of poor data. But if we look at the other municipalities in the list, you can see that between 45 and 50% of the operating budgets are going to personnel. But at the same time, we see vacancies in these municipalities, especially for skilled positions. And so you have this massive salary expenditure coinciding with vacancies and skills shortages, which result in poor service delivery. Another interesting data set to look at is the Stats SA non-financial census of municipalities. Those are the blue bars that you see. And those blue bars show the percentage of households in a particular municipalities in particular provinces, and what percentage of those households are registered as indigent. So for instance, if you look at Western Cape, you'll see that 18.9% of municipalities are registered as indigent. Well, if you compare this to, for example, Northwest, you'll see that only 10% of the municipalities are, so the households are registered as indigent in their municipalities. In Mpumalanga, only 7.6%. And yet we know that provinces like the Northwest and Mpumalanga are actually poorer than the Western Cape. And interestingly enough, with the pandemic, we would expect the number of registered indigent households to increase, given the loss of livelihoods and the loss of jobs. But when we look at the non-financial census of municipalities, we find that the registrations are actually decreasing, which is not a very good signal in terms of extending basic services to those who cannot afford to pay for them. So our issues are not just financial, they're also operational as well. Just to give some of you who are not steeped in this particular area, just a quick overview of the vertical division of revenue trends for the sphere. If you look at the line here, which is main budget expenditure, you can think about it as the total amount that government at national, provincial government can have available to spend. And what then happens is that debt service costs, interest costs, and the contingency reserve is taken off from that. it's called top slicing. And then what remains after that, the non-interest allocations, is to all intents and purposes, the amount which is available to be split among the three spheres of government. And, you can look here at the bottom what that vertical division of revenue is. In other words, the split of available funds after top slice among the three spheres of government. So for 21-22, we see that national departments are expected to get about 49.5%, provinces 41.5%, and local government gets 9% of that vertical division. And the argument has always been that they have own revenue sources, and therefore really funds coming from national should be to cover basic services. And if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework over the next 2 years, you'll see that those amounts as a percentage of the available funds, which can be divided among those three spheres, for local government, it's expected to increase to 9.6% and 9.7%. This is having declined as a percentage in 2019-20 to 8.3%. And if you look at it not from a percentage terms, but in terms of numbers, absolute numbers, we can then look at this top green box. And what we'll see is that roughly about 138.1 billion comes to the local government sphere in the division of revenue. That is increasing to 146.1 billion next year and 148.4 billion. If you look at the average annual growth over the medium-term expenditure framework period, it's about 2.3%. And it could be argued that this growth for local government is greater than the growth for provinces, which is about 1%, and for national departments, which is a contraction of 2.8% over the MTF period. However, when you look at these numbers, just bear in mind that a 2.3% increase is in nominal terms. And if you look at the inflation rate, especially increases in a wage bill, etc., you actually might be looking at a real loss, a decline in the real value as well. So now that I've given just a snapshot of the numbers, I just want to look at some of the longer term sustainability issues which are relevant for looking at the local government fiscal framework. And for me, what I thought was quite interesting was that the local government fiscal framework has become unstable. There's been a reduction in certainty and predictability for municipalities. And there are a host of reasons for that. When we look at fiscal consolidation at national level, obviously it trickles down to all three spheres. And that was the case even before the pandemic. And, with the pandemic, that is set to increase and intensify further. Then is the inability to constrain personnel costs, which we've discussed before. But our system is structured that aggregates are enforced. And so what you find is that these personnel costs then squeeze out complementary inputs that are needed for service delivery. And so what this leads to is what Michael Sachs calls fiscal austerity without fiscal consolidation. And one of the key factors for the instability in the local government fiscal framework has been the instability and underperformance of our revenue collection at SARS. All of us have followed, or at least some of us, the Nugent Commission looked at the impact of the state capture decade on SARS's ability to collect revenues. And I think that if we look at the longer term, there's also the impact of the pandemic on our national tax base. And we know from experience the financial crisis that we saw about 10 years ago, that it takes quite a long time for the tax base to rebound to the state it was prior to that particular shock. And we also see that there have been a number of drastic fundamental changes in the environment in which municipalities operate. And so, for instance, we see regulatory decisions in respect of water and electricity that impact severely on the sphere. So, for example, if you look at nurses' decisions where municipalities haven't been allowed to pass on the full cost of increases in bulk electricity, for instance, to their clients, that erodes the surpluses that they have available, either to cross-subsidize within that particular service area or cross-service areas, or to invest in infrastructure upgrade and renewal and extension, which they need. And, with the drought, there have been long-term shifts in water consumption, with the need to transition to a lower carbon footprint. We've seen declines in electricity consumption, and that is likely to continue. Both the water and electricity industries will be going through significant restructuring. We've been awaiting this for nearly a decade, but we might see movement in that, and that will have severe impacts for municipalities as well. And so when we look at these impacts on the local government fiscal framework, it's not just changes in economic activity and business cycles, it's fundamental changes in these deep contextual and policy scenarios. And I think that as a result of the revenue challenges at national level, fiscal consolidation, all of those challenges filter down to the local government sphere, and the local government equitable share and conditional grants are no longer as certain as they used to be. And what we're seeing is, instead of progressive realization of basic services, we're seeing regressive tendencies. I think the examples from the non-financial census illustrated that. And also, there are increasing calls for creating new entitlements. For example, there's calls for basic income grants. There's the national health insurance that need to be funded, et cetera, and all those are competing claims on the fiscus. And often there are more, it's more politically profiled to work in those areas and to fund those than to actually fully fund your existing entitlements. And there are also a number of local government functional framework issues that have remained unresolved. So the idea is that your functional framework says who does what, and your fiscal framework is basically how do you balance your expenditures and revenues in order to finance and make those functional delivery mandates happen. And in this particular area, for example, the role of district municipalities and the fact that they don't have an own revenue sources to replace the abolished RSC levies, this area of uncertainty has languished for more than a decade. And often different decisions are taken at a sectoral level, which cumulatively impact on the sphere without focusing on how these functional shifts coherently relate to local government as a sphere. And as I said before, there is enduring tension between the centralized wage bargaining outcomes and the ability of municipalities to be able to afford escalating salary bills. So if we take a step back, and people like Philip van Reineveld will really remember this, but when you look at the white paper on local government, you'll see that at that stage it was felt that municipalities on average would be able to finance 90% of their recurrent expenditure out of their own revenues. And, I think that I had an interesting email exchange with Stephen about the fact that, when you look at where we are currently, that 90% is more like 70 to 73%, which is quite a considerable underestimation of, how it was originally conceptualized. And, when you cast your mind back to 1998 and the local government white paper, at the time, bulk electricity prices were in South Africa were one of the lowest in the world. But since then, we've seen substantial increases. We've seen demand management measures because of climate change and load shedding as well. And so, these have become structural features of the landscape in which municipalities have to operate. And there've also been changing delivery models, which have also impacted cost. For example, when you look at regionalization of landfill sites, it's critical from an environmental point of view, but it may increase costs for municipalities because now they have to deal with transport, etc. And there've also been new technologies developed in the interim. For example, renewable energy microgrids, if you look at embedded generation, small-scale embedded generation, etc., which haven't really been fully assimilated within our financial and regulatory frameworks. And there's also been long identified a need for own revenue sources, which haven't really been addressed, while at the same time, new legislation such as AUTO, the administrative adjudication of road traffic offences, are kicking in, and this will impact on municipalities' fine revenue, for instance. So, revenue from fines is not a huge a source of revenue for municipalities, but many municipalities do depend on it, and having to forgo that revenue does impact on them. And then there's also been a plethora of court cases, which have also impacted on the expenditure obligations of municipalities as well. And when you take all of these changes together collectively, I think an argument can be made that the local government fiscal framework needs to be reviewed so that finance can function a lot more coherently, and there can be a lot more congruence. But obviously, this requires quite a good change management strategy as well. And while we look at these kind of big picture structural changes, there's no doubt that individual municipalities will have to take what steps they can in order to bolster their fiscal sustainability and resilience. And this includes hard decisions on how they manage their cost of employment budgets. Often municipalities have been undergoing cost cutting, at least in the Western Cape for the last 3-4 years, and that might be the only area of so-called fat in the budget. How they prioritize their capital programs to make sure that it actually balances revenue generation with the fact that there needs to be extension of basic services as well. Tariff setting to try and build up operating reserves, capital reserves, at the same time, while the pandemic has undermined livelihoods and loss of jobs, making that extremely difficult, optimizing existing revenue sources, and also dealing with partially funded mandates. In our sample, there are some municipalities that are doing functions which are not strictly within their mandate. So they could choose to jettison those functions, but often municipalities argue that they have to provide those services to their communities. And then also, efficiency increasing measures such as reducing non-revenue water and electricity as well. And so, when I just pausing now to conclude, I just want to make the remarks that while there is a fundamental need for reconfiguration of the local government fiscal framework, in my opinion, it's certainly not going to be a panacea. There are lots of other factors which also need to be addressed. But we have to take into consideration that technology is evolving. And, in 25 years, you can't assume that the same trends that we've had in the past are going to continue into the future. And we need to think about how we take those trends on board. To also note that despite 25 years into local government, our information that we have from the sphere, the availability, reliability, and completeness of municipal information still leaves much to be desired, especially when you're trying to understand, what is the economic and fiscal base of municipalities. There's another census coming up. Myself and other academics and practitioners will keenly be watching those figures to see, how those impacts have filtered through. And, just make the important but obvious point that economic growth is really imperative to ensuring municipal sustainability. So, what national government does in terms of its economic growth and recovery plan, is absolutely critical. And it's important to note that, it's not just the challenge to increase the level of growth, it's also trying to change the nature of growth to try and make it more inclusive, green, and digital friendly. And municipalities face a kind of chicken and an egg situation where they need to deliver basic services not only for equity considerations, but also to grow the local economy and prevent businesses like Clover dairies relocating, closing down, etc. But on the other hand, they also need funds to be able to do that. They have a primary responsibility to raise their own funds, but in many cases, that fiscal capacity is not there, or the fiscal effort is not there. So, with those thoughts, I want to hand back to Jaap and hand back to the other colleagues, and we can take the discussion further.
Thank you so much, Tania. This is really excellent. And the one thought that comes to mind is everything is connected. We often look at local government as sort of insulated from the rest of government, and that choices that we see being made at national government level, they don't have an impact on local government, but you make it so clear that it is all connected. I'm not an economist, and I'm not necessarily very good with numbers, but when you showed us those figures, and I saw the ballooning debt service costs there, how much we are going to spend and are spending on servicing our debt is quite frightening, and all these things have an impact on local government. I think you've shown very clearly that really some of those assumptions that we had in the white paper on local government, they may have held true for a while, but they're no longer valid. There are so many things that have changed, and that needs to be taken into account in the way we look at intergovernmental fiscal relations. So thank you very much, and also thanks for presenting it in a way that really is accessible also to some of us that are not economists and that are not necessarily well versed with all these issues, and connecting it to human rights and to governance. I think really useful. So I'm really looking forward to Stephen Kenyon's input. I saw he was in the room, and I hope he's ready to respond. Again, Mr. Kenyon has a long history in intergovernmental fiscal relations, knows the equitable share formula probably better than anyone from his previous position in the National Treasury and now in the Western Cape Provincial Treasury. charged, amongst other things, with overseeing the fiscal framework and financial management in municipalities in the Western Cape. So Stephen, once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hand over to you, and we look forward to your input, and then we'll have a bit of a broader conversation. Stephen, over to you. Stephen, are you there with us? We're not hearing you yet. I think something is coming. Yeah. No sound yet on my side, Stephen.
I think you need to unmute yourself, Stephen.
We're not hearing you yet. No sound yet. Maybe while Stephen is working on his audio, Tania, is the original report, is it available? I know that obviously we have the bulletin articles with summaries, but there was one question in the chat about whether the original report on the fiscal sustainability of Western Cape municipalities. I know this was done in partnership with the Western Cape government, so I'm not sure if the original report is accessible.
Yeah, the original report is open to the public. I don't think it's on a website anyway, but what we can do is put it on a website and then provide you with a link that we can then circulate it. I think it's a good trend that reports are actually made available to the public. And I think that that's one of the reasons why myself and the SPL team are investing so much time in doing dissemination. Because for students out there, for instance, they might not even know that these reports are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks so much.
Perfect timing, Stephen. Over to you.
No, sorry for interrupting there. I thought I was on a test still.
No,
okay, so there's my experiments with IT for the morning. Thanks. So I was saying that thank you very much for a fascinating presentation and a really useful collation of data. Perhaps a little bit of background about myself. I'm, as Professor de Visser says, a former official from National Treasury, where I used to work on the Local Government Equitable Share in the Division of Revenue there, and I now work actually in the Provincial Treasury in the Western Cape, not the Department of Local Government, just for clarity. So monitoring and oversight of some of the municipalities in the province, and I see there are some of them in the meeting here as well. So I'm still a public servant, and so I have a little bit of latitude, more latitude than I had in my old job to critique the National Treasury, but not that much. I am still on the government payroll, and I certainly couldn't comment on the election outcomes, etc. as well. So just a few constraints on my side. I should also say that it's great to see several of the National Treasury colleagues in the forum as well. And I noticed that in the article and in the discussion this morning, Tania has noted that the Budget Forum, which is the main consultative structure on local government finances, chaired by the Minister of Finance and with SALGA and the provinces as members, that forum is engaged in a review of the local government fiscal framework. So, you know, I've had the honor of listening in on some of those discussions. And as you say, Professor de Visser, it is a very interconnected system. And I think it's worth reflecting on some of the I can't talk to what happens in those rooms in government consultations, but that National Treasury and the Budget Forum structure are engaged in quite a wide-ranging review and discussion of these topics, and it's really quite impressive, some of what they've put together. It is a big topic though, and it's interesting that they've sort of chosen to break it out by themes and look at particular aspects of it in that way. And I think, in all of these discussions, it just very quickly becomes evident that you've got so many interconnected aspects in any discussion of the local government fiscal framework that it becomes difficult. You can get sort of easily drawn into some of the minutiae of a particular aspect and perhaps lose track of the broader picture. So what I'm going to try and do in my response is to try and pick out some of the areas where I think we could maybe develop the argument a bit more that Tania is making here. And in particular, I was excited to see that her article was titled "A Radical Reconfiguration," and I want to provoke Tania and the audience perhaps a bit about what some of those proposals what radical might look like in this context. So let me start from the functional issues that Professor Ajam has raised in the article. So I mean, there are a lot of functional hangovers. We've mentioned unfunded budgets, role of districts. Tania's gone into, in some detail, issues around the water and electricity sectors. I mean, there have been a lot of, I would say, almost half-finished reforms in the local government space and attempts at reform. So, I mean, one of the biggest reforms that we saw 5 years ago was on the merger of municipalities. And we've seen recently a whole lot of people raising issues around the size of municipalities again and the viability of individual municipalities. And I think, Professor De Visser, your team have done a lot of good work on exploring what the benefits of the potential impact of mergers was ahead of that 2016 reconfiguration of local government. And I think you don't have to, I haven't seen a comprehensive study of the impact of those mergers, but I don't think you have to really look very far to see that in almost all of those merged municipalities, that was, I would say, pretty clearly a failed experiment, right? That you put together exactly as I think the work you did in collaboration with the FFC at the time made the sort of very obvious, very simple point that if you add 0 and 0 together, you're not going to get 1. And if you merge 2 weak municipalities, and in many cases you merged a weak with a semi-weak, and the one that was just about making it then was actually dragged down to the level of the one that was merged into. So it's a lesson in reforms that can go wrong. And yeah, as Zolani is saying in the chat, it's been disastrous for so many of those municipalities. So it's a caution for all of us about the ease with which sometimes national players can feel that they can make radical changes and that those will be solutions. And if they're not implemented properly, if they're not fully thought through, and there were plenty of warnings at that time, the things can go horribly wrong. So I'd be interested in people's views on some of the other radical changes in the functional space that could be done. I mean, the role of districts is always a topical one, and especially with the district development model now, sort of reasserts the primacy of the role of districts. There has previously been discussion about single-tier municipalities and where that might be applicable, etc. And the relative functionality of districts. That I think is something that has to be on the agenda in any kind of radical rethink because of the functional framework, which of course leads into the fiscal framework. I mean, Treasury officials are fond of saying that funding follows functions, and the logic of that is often that you would need to think about changes to the functional framework before you would think the consequent changes that would come in the fiscal framework. And I think Tania's gone very nicely into some of the changes in particular municipal services. And the water services and some of the regulatory things there. And I mean, in rural municipalities, water is primarily provided by district municipalities. And I think there's a question, if we're being radical here, right? There's a question about the kind of service that's being provided and whether there's scope for regional water utilities and what the role of municipalities needs to be in that structure. You know, municipalities are a democratic sphere of government. They're intended to give people democratic oversight over local government functions. And to my mind, there's always a question mark around that with district government, because you've got a mix of indirect and direct voting onto a district. You've got districts, usually in those water service providing districts, you've got over 1 million people in the district. You know, you're not really having, it's not really local democracy in a classic sense anymore. And the supply of water is a largely, you know, technical and engineering matter, or it's a community scheme. And district municipalities seem to find themselves in the worst of both of those combinations. They're too big to be providing oversight of community schemes, and then they're too much caught up in the kind of, you know, they're not set up to be technical utilities in the way that a water board or some similar structure is. So I think that, you know, there's scope always for those kind of discussions. On the electricity side, I mean, there was a huge push towards reform in the 90s on REDS, regional electricity distribution, that was then stalled. Since then, there's been a huge change in renewable energy, in the future of energy generation, in the future of embedded generation, and you know, everyone in the electricity business is going to have to reconsider their business model. And in the Western Cape, we're working, you know, we have our own municipal energy resilience program, where we're looking at these kind of questions, and they're fiendishly complicated questions, and it's going to be a little bit different for different municipalities. But the role of all players in the electricity distribution business is going to have to change in light of renewables. The other complicating factor there always is that municipalities find that electricity supply is one of the best ways to ensure revenue collection on other services as well. So there's a tension there, but there's a big risk that a lot of non-poor customers will move off the grid, and the nature of that business can change quite dramatically. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through all the services, but I think Tania's given a good overview of how in each of the services, which are supposed to be run on a kind of cost recovery basis, you have what may have been able to generate surpluses historically. You have business models that are going to be fundamentally changing. And I think, you know, logically that leads you to say, well, then municipal, that is de facto, whether we review the white paper or not, that's de facto a change in the assumptions behind the local government fiscal model, whether we as policymakers do it deliberately or not. And where does that leave us? And if the cost recovery from services isn't going to deliver profits anymore, it means that general functions can really only be funded in going forward, I would say, from the two other sources of local government revenue, right, which are taxes and transfers. And we've discussed a little bit about transfers earlier, and Tania took us through the National Division of Revenue, which funds transfers, but we haven't talked a lot about local government taxes. I was interested to see Tania did raise the possibility of new taxes, and I'd be interested, because that's obviously a radical proposal. What would new local government taxes be? But I think in discussions like this, we often underestimate the power of property rates. That is the tax instrument that is given to the primary tax instrument that's given to local government in this country. And if you look internationally, I mean, our level of property rates is about 1.5 to 2% of GDP, depending on how you measure it, etc., which is quite respectable and comparable to several developed countries if you look at sort of OECD indexes, etc., which is a huge strength in our system. A lot of developing countries are trying to get to where we are. A lot of developing countries look at property rates, they say, oh, this is a really good tax. It's a wealth tax. It has a lot of benefits to it. If it's structured correctly, it can aid sort of developmental objectives, land taxes, etc. But when they look at it, I mean, you have to run a property rate system, you have to measure the value of every property in the country, which is an insane administrative burden for any developing country starting out. And we're gifted with a system that already does that, with a very sophisticated property rate system. You know, most developing countries are looking at sort of property rates like systems, etc. We have the strength of already having a strong property rate system with all those valuation roles updated every 4 years, etc., etc. The FFC study that Tania linked to, I think it's the 2020 recommendations, had some interesting work on whether municipalities are collecting what's owed to them on the property rate system. And I mean, in broad summary, it shows that in urban municipalities, based on their statistical models, it's kind of 70 to 80% of achievable revenue is being collected from that source. But in rural municipalities, it's between 40 and I think 56%, the study found. I mean, I can't give you a view on you know, whether there are flaws with that study, but that suggests that there's a big pool of tax revenue that's not subject to these kind of vagaries of the business models of electricity, water, etc., that is out there for the taking. And I think we're not discussing what the radical interventions are, you know, I mean, on getting rural property rates to work properly, on how we use property rates as a land tax. What are the advantages of it as a wealth tax? How are we leveraging off of those? And I mean, the one issue to raise always is property on traditional land, because it's, you know, you see in a city like Polokwane, you have basically huge suburbs, very nice houses, double-story, triple garage houses that are on traditional land where property rates is not being levied. And if you have wealthy households like that aren't paying into the system, but are drawing services from it, you know, you're never going to be able to balance. We have an incredible challenge in this country with such profound inequality to have a fairly narrow tax base and a huge demand for services. If we're leaving out some of those wealthy individuals, we're never going to be able to bridge that gap. So I've obviously put a pin in the idea of what potential new taxes could be. On the transfers side, yeah, I mean, if you don't have the taxes, I mean, the transfer side does I think the National Treasury documents do a great job of showing how the transfer system does this redistribution, right? It raises revenue in wealthy parts of the country, in the suburbs of Sandton and Bishop's Court, etc., and then transfers funds to more rural municipalities. The comments on the equitable share, I mean, to me, that's what the equitable share is able to do. The local government equitable share shifts funds towards rural and poorer municipalities and on a per capita basis. But as Tania did a great job in walking us through that table of the division of revenue, I mean, the growth there, it's just hard to imagine a scenario in which you're going to see strong growth in the local government transfers again. National fiscal consolidation is so difficult already that to see, I mean, I think it's incumbent on us as local government advocates to fight on the margins, right? It terrifies me at the moment that there is below per capita growth, never mind, and below inflation growth on transfers to local government, because that's going to really put a squeeze, unlike what we've seen before, on transfer dependent municipalities. But it's hard. I mean, you know, with provincial services under the squeeze, national services, the demands for additional services, it's hard to see a fundamental rebalancing in the transfers. I would also say on the theme of sort of radical approaches, I mean, it's very striking that when you look at all of those indices, Tania was taking us through the News 24 one, if you look at the municipal IQ one, wherever you see an index of performance of municipalities, the municipalities that perform best tend to be the municipalities with a strong own revenue funding base for their budgets, right? Transfer-dependent municipalities just don't do as well in most cases. There are some exceptions to that, but in most cases, and that's one of, I mean, if you look back at the assumptions of the white paper, the numbers, as Tania says, have changed, right? So the original assumption was that municipalities would fund 90% from own revenues. Now it's sort of 3/4 from own revenues on aggregate. But the transfer, but one of the assumptions in that white paper, one of the underlying principles, was that local own revenue was one of the sources of accountability in the municipal system, accountability to your ratepayers, etc. And I think we see that that assumption is borne out pretty well in terms of the performance of municipalities. The study that Tania and team did on Western Cape municipalities and their relative resilience, etc., I think that links a lot to the benefits of being own revenue funded. And that's why I put such a strong emphasis on property rates and other taxes and that tax side of local government. So lastly, then to turn to the questions of expenditure that have been raised. And I think here we have to look at the efficiency of expenditure. And I think one of the questions that's posed in the radical reconfiguration article is around, and in the Parry piece that it links to as well, is around the relaxation or tightening of rules on conditional grants, allowing municipalities more scope to more flexibility on conditions, etc. And I think when you pose questions like that, a lot of what one of the things you have to think about is what is the biggest crisis that we're dealing with, and is it that municipalities are trying to make good choices and then being tripped up by national rules, or are we in a situation where in most municipalities the kind of choices that are being made are questionable, it's hard. There's always a mixed picture, right? So there are municipalities that are making great choices and are tripped up by rules. But having just been through election campaign season and seen that so-called sports stadium in the Eastern Cape, it's hard not to look at a project like that and think, shouldn't the grant rules have been tighter? Shouldn't there have been more oversight, etc.? So I'm always a fan of a differentiated approach on rules like that. And I think we've seen some tentative steps in the system towards that. But I think we have to, when so many municipalities are performing so poorly, there are some difficult questions to ask about flexibility versus oversight. And I mean, in terms of measuring the impact of what additional funds do in municipalities, I can tell you as a former Treasury official, one of the most difficult things to argue in sort of budget negotiations for increased allocations for local government is what the impact will be of an additional rand that goes into the local government sphere. And I think we as local government advocates have to acknowledge the fragility of the case there. You know, when you're sitting in a negotiation on the division of revenue, if you put an additional rand into the healthcare system, if you can, especially if you put it into HIV/AIDS conditional grant funding, right? You can lower the CD4 count at which you start AZT treatment. You know, that has calculable impacts. You can show for every billion rand you put in there, you can extend average life expectancy by X amount. I don't know what it works out on, and the HDI score of the country. It's a very clear transmission bill. You put it into the police system. You can show how many additional police you will employ with a great degree of certainty. The exact impact on crime may be less clear. You put it into social grants, you can show very clearly what the impacts on poverty is going to be. That's very efficient spending. You put it into the local government sphere, how much of it's going to get to free basic services to poor households? Honestly, we did this. This is again an experiment that has been run. The Local Government Equitable Share formula, when we reviewed it the last time, and introduced a new formula in 2013, there were tremendous changes in the allocations to some municipalities. Some rural, it was a much more pro-rural and pro-poor formula. And the impact of that, it increased in some rural municipalities, increased allocations by up to 50%. And the Treasury and one of the colleagues who still works in the Treasury, Letsepa, went back 5 years later and looked at what the impact had been there. And we looked at the sort of 12 municipalities that had had the biggest increases. And the biggest impacts were not in service delivery funding. Most of the money, and it's budget analysis and the data questions, MSCOA would make this a similar exercise in future much easier, one would hope. But as far as we could tell, most of the money seemed to go into salaries, into employment. Some of that could be good, but it seemed like there wasn't a big increase in employee numbers. Most of it seemed to go into higher pay scales for existing employees. And some of that can be merited, but I think it's certainly not what one thinks when you think you're increasing funding to poor municipalities. It's certainly as someone who was involved with the review, it's not what I had hoped for as the outcome. And I think until we can get a better transmission of benefits into poor and indigent households, it's going to be hard to argue for increased transfers, which is why I think it's important, and I liked Zolani's comments about the Western Cape in the chat earlier, but it's important that provinces play an active role in monitoring municipal budgets and in trying to steer municipalities back to making sure that their budgets do prioritize services and service delivery. So that would be kind of my conclusion to all of this. There are a lot of radical ideas out there. Some of them are dangerous, but in a sense, and maybe this is corny, but getting the basics right is a pretty radical proposition right now in too many municipalities. And I think there's a strong case to be made for that as an important dimension of this. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really, really great. A very sober but detailed, I think, response. And I'm really looking forward to some of Tania's responses. And I want to hand over to her in a minute, just for an immediate response before we go to the rest of the participants. But I also like the point you made about the failed mergers. And I remember that discussion. And I still get asked the question every now and then, is that a solution? And aside from the 0 plus 0 doesn't make one truism, there was another dimension to it that I realized afterwards, is that it's all good and well for the Municipal Demarcation Board to assume that there's going to be efficiencies and even calculate those. But then after they take the decision to merge 2 or 3 municipalities, they have no longer any control over the process. And then the 2 or 3 municipalities start negotiating. And then the hard reality of these things, and actually you can predict it, and we probably should have predicted it, is that you need to achieve salary parity. You have 2 or 3 organograms that come together. Of course, nobody loses their jobs because the unions will be there to make sure that nobody loses their job. So there's no reduction in staff count. Nobody is going to accept a reduction in salary because, again, we have strong protection and unions will be forceful. So in the end, all it does is create an upward cost sort of spiral where everything must be made equal, and people who earned less than the equivalent staff member in the other municipality will now have to earn more. So in the end, it resulted in nothing but upward spirals of costs. So these mergers have not produced what we thought they would. So I think that was a fascinating point. I think the issue of the oversight, and I know Tania and I had a discussion about it a while ago about, yes, the equitable share is there and it goes to municipalities and aimed at funding free basic services, but then it gets used for other things. Whose responsibility is it to oversee that? There was calls for National Treasury to become much more involved and conduct oversight and intervene. But yeah, where are the provincial treasuries in that picture? How do they, as you say, steer and nudge and do whatever they can to get municipalities to spend equitable share where it's supposed to be spent? And I think even probably more importantly, we now have formally, since I think 2 days ago, institutionalized municipal public accounts committees. Of course, they were there for years already. But shouldn't they be the primary champions of how municipalities spend this precious transfer that's meant for free basic services? And I'm also sort of again thinking of the statistics that Tania put out about how the indigent registers are compiled and how there are differences between provinces that really cannot be explained on the basis of the poverty profile of those provinces. So the way municipalities put together their indigent registers, I think is also a really big problem. So I've got a few notes that I've made of things that I want to pick up on the basis of what people have produced in the chat. But I think as a matter of courtesy and interest, I really want to hear Tania's first take on Stephen's input. Tania, your response, maybe?
Thanks, Jaap. I don't want to answer comprehensively because I'd rather listen to what the audience have to say. But I just want to say hallelujah, amen on getting the basics right. And just point to the minimum competence standards. I want to point out that municipal officials are actually reasonably well paid compared to academics, right? Certainly most senior Section 57 officials get paid more than I do as an associate professor, right? So why can't we enforce minimum competence? Why is it that after 25 years, we still don't have a local government school where if you enter local government, you get trained for at least a year so that you understand governance, that you have the skills before you are let out, right? Maybe we could say that we couldn't do that immediately, but come on, 25 years after the fact, we can't do that, right? Okay, because you can talk about money, but at the end of the day, people make a system work. And if you have a good people, they will make a bad system work. But if you have bad people, no matter how good your institutional design, it will basically fail, right? So I think that we in South Africa, we want new formulas, we want new organizational designs, but we actually don't want to get to the nitty-gritty, which is actually, the people involved. And, just a quick comment on property rates. In rural areas, I do think that is intimately tied to land tenure, settlement forms. And so that's an example where the non-financial governance issues need to be explored and discussed and change managed before you can actually look at the technical finance issues. I do think that, Stephen raised the issue of regional water services, provisions, etc., and, how there's a tension between economies of scale and, democratic accountability and grassroots control and oversight. But for me, I think that the larger point is that we need to move towards more asymmetrical solutions, right? Asymmetrical delivery models, and also look at what that means for finance, because we have had 25 years of experience, and based on that 25 years, we can reasonably project what the outcomes are likely to be. And there are new revenue sources that could be explored, for example, land value capture mechanisms. But then you need to make sure that your governance structures are absolutely clear, absolutely transparent, because otherwise you're just going to get a looting frenzy, in just different form. So I do just want to also agree with Stephen on efficiency issues, right? And the poor choices that municipalities make. For instance, we talked about the wage bill. There is a mechanism that you can ask for exemption from the wage bill. But if you look at who asks for exemption, it's not the municipalities that have the highest percentage of personnel as a proportion of operating expenditures. It's municipalities in the Western Cape that are asking for that exemption, right? So even when mechanisms do exist, it's not politically feasible to really make use of them. And then to also just point out that we are moving into the digital age. And, one could argue that, for instance, in the rural areas, there might be a role for district municipalities to get involved with last mile connection where population densities are so low that it's not attractive to private sector providers. So we also need to look to the future as well, because, the structure of production is going to change with digitization. So with those thoughts, I just want to hand over to the audience. I think we've got practitioners and academics in the audience. It would be great to hear their views as well.
Great, thank you, Tania. Let me quickly summarize a few points that I've picked up in the chat and just sort of throw them out, and then maybe Tania and Stephen, you can make some notes and see if you can respond to some of them, and then I'll go to the audience. So we have one question from Evan Berger about, what's the feasibility or what are the constraints on municipalities taking over more national mandates linked to specific conditional grants? Why are we not looking at actually greater devolution of functions to local government where capacity exists, obviously within a strict framework of conditional grants? So maybe a response to that. P.S. Reddy was asking about billing problems in municipalities. I think I don't know, Tania, to what extent you came across that also in the Western Cape study. I would imagine that I don't hear often of huge billing problems in Western Cape municipalities, but I think it's a huge problem elsewhere in some other municipalities, and of course links to the getting the basics right argument that we are making. Tandani asked a question to Stephen about just sort of a general response to how do equitable share affects semi-urban and rural municipalities in particular. I think there was some comment on it in your input, but if you could maybe sort of reflect on that a bit. And then a question from Zolani on the powers and functions bill and development charges. I think, Tania, you mentioned it, land value capture issues. To what extent would development charges really be, I think, a very promising, perhaps new source of revenue? And how, Stephen, you're not with the National Treasury any longer, but anything you would know about that bill or where it's at or what the prospects of development charges are, I think would be welcome. And again, I think Tania already mentioned something about, the governance that needs to be in place before that could be a viable instrument. Shirley is asking about, the tools for oversight. I think it's a good point. It's good for us to point at the role of provincial treasuries in conducting oversight, but in the end, what tools, what mechanisms are there if a municipality doesn't want to, let's say, doesn't want to listen? It's a long shot to go for intervention. That's sort of the ultimate, response to a collapse. But what are the sort of the practical tools for oversight? So those are the things that I picked up under collection in rural areas. I think we've made, and about the property rates, I think the squeezing out of the poor with those very complicated valuations that you spoke about, Stephen. I think some concern expressed in the chat about, what does it mean locally about, linking it to market value? What does it mean for people in areas, and the Bokap was mentioned, I think, as a classic example. Maybe a response to that would be great. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to pose a question verbally? I think we have a bit of time, so if you want to come in and just respond or make a comment. And by the way, Tania, I really appreciate your point about academics and managers in municipalities. I completely agree. And that's a topic for another webinar, salary parity between academics and the rest of the world. But okay, maybe not for today. I see Mutoto's got his hand up, and Philip. Let me just check if there's anyone else. It would be great to hear from them. Let me just see if there's anyone else. Not at the moment. Mutoto, you want to go first, and then we go to Philip.
Thanks, Prof. And I see my friend Stephen is enjoying Cape Town, and I didn't know that Tania is now a prof. So it looks like the fiscal environment is taking more of her time. I just wanted to comment on the issue of measures. Now that I happen to be in the area of demarcation where you correctly indicated that the report from the FFC once indicated that it's like adding -1 plus -1 and expect to get a 0. At that time, I was in Cocta working with Stephen on the issue of the equitable share. My comment is really based on the observations that I've made when I came to the MDB, and some of the things that I think, Tania, you touched on it, is the issue around the governance. And Prof, you mentioned the issue around the transitional mechanisms and how do we get involved after the MDB has delivered 2 municipalities that might have merged. How do we get involved into the issues around the transitional arrangements thereof? And I know this is an area that we have now identified as the board as an area that is having serious weaknesses, because you will have all the 5 KRAs, the human resource part, your governance part, your communications, your bylaws, and all those kind of things that have to be merged to another established municipality. And we have said to ourselves that maybe some of us as stakeholders were not playing our part. One of the things that I've said to the board here was that I think the Minister of Finance has not played his part, because we can put a measure out there and the Minister of Finance can say, but if I look at the configuration of the equitable share, this municipality is not going to hold. Let's postpone the implementation or the effective date by another 3 years when we are sorting out all these other few things. But quickly, Prof, we have done 2 studies from our side on the measures and the effect of the measures or measure the areas that they have in 2 municipalities. We did Mangaung and Polokwane. And our study was based on 4 indicators. The first one was finance and governance indicators. The next one, we looked at the socio-demographic indicators, and then the economic indicators, and lastly, the spatial indicators. Now, we then realized that the outcome was that, except for the spatial indicator, all the other indicators went down when you go to the merged entity. So you find that on the governance side, there was in Polokwane there was a little bit of an improvement, which was outside of the norm, because in Mangaung, governance and finance indicators went down. Socio-demographic indicators, they did not perform adequately. So we were comparing before the merger and after the merger, and we realize that there are those kind of things that are coming up. Now, that has then necessitated that we need to look at these things broadly and say what kind of criteria should the MDB use on top of what is provided in the legislation. Things that we are talking about now in terms of your property rate processes, your basic service delivery issues, but more importantly, the issue of governance, because I would want to agree with Tania that no matter how good your institutional design can be, if you have a municipality where the kind of people that are there have not even a clue what kind of a program they need to put together for them to be running an effective municipality, it won't work. So my main issue is that we need to deal with the issue of governance and be able to appoint people who are competent. We can even forget about the salaries that they are getting that are more than professors. But if you look at the output that these people can bring is minus 20, they can't bring anything. So you may even have all the revenue sources that you can identify. But if you don't have a deliberate public servant who is able to then say, this is how this council must look at all these revenue sources that we have identified. And we have also identified the people that can be able to pay because we have all our indigence registers in place and all those kind of things. If you don't get that, we must just forget that local government will ever move an inch further. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much, Mtoto. Very interesting insights, important insights on the merger issue. So thank you so much for that. Philip van Reineveld, over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Jaap, and thank you to everybody. And this is such a good discussion and such an important discussion because I think we're at an important moment of renewal. We have a new political cycle and we have a context where the national government, I think, is committed to change in constructive ways. I think it's focusing on other things to a large degree at the moment, but I think there's an opportunity here at the local level to have a really important sort of moment of renewal over the next 5 years. The other thing that I think strikes me as remarkable is if I look at the election results coming through, there are only 2 metros where they're at this stage. I don't know what's going to happen in eThekwini, but there are only 2 metros that are going over 50% for any one political party. So that is Buffalo City for the ANC and Cape Town for the DA. I don't know yet whether the results are in for eThekwini. But what that means is that you are having coalition governments, which in my view, if they're done well, could be really constructive and in fact, help fashion a better relationship between state and party, leading to a more independent civil service. And I think, you know, the Institute here has got a lot of role. Many of the people in this room, I think, should be contributing to the debate as to how to make these coalition governments work in a way that strengthens the creation of an independent, professional, well-trained, appropriately paid local civil service, which I think a number of the speakers have spoken about. So I do think it's a really important moment. I was pleased to see the attention to the notion of asymmetry. We have such differences across the country. I wasn't actually involved in that local white paper in 1998, because at that stage I was in city government itself, so sort of only peripherally involved. But that figure of 90% of own revenues, you know, really there's such a massive difference between the metros and the big Bs versus the rural areas. So you can expect places like Johannesburg and Tshwane and Cape Town and so on to be collecting 90% of the revenue, but others, maybe it's often closer to 10%. So coming up with plans that recognize that asymmetry is really important. And I do think that the question of the B-C relationship, the districts and the category B local authorities, we've let that drift in so many ways. That's the one important consideration in terms of functions. The other that hasn't been mentioned and which is difficult at the moment in the country is the question of transport and public transport. There was an amendment bill that was going through Parliament that sought to provincialize a lot of the transport functions. The President has actually sent that back to Parliament saying this is unconstitutional. There are quite a lot of important issues in transport and how that relates to local government. But just to finish quickly on the local revenue sources, I was involved with in a project now about 15 years ago with National Treasury on the municipal fiscal framework. It was around the time of the abolition of the RSC levies and people looking for alternatives. We had Richard Bird, who some of you will know for local government finance, one of the real sort of experts over many, many decades in local government finance, working on the project, and came up with the idea of a local business tax to replace the RSC levy. The vision was that it would be administered as part of the national tax collection process, but that it would have sort of local characteristics that would allow some influence local government about rates and so on. I don't want to go into the technicalities of those, but I think it's important to look at that again. In the end, what happened was that in the bigger metros, they got a share, or in the metros, they got a share of the fuel levy. And of course, with the shift to electric vehicles over the next decade, the fuel levy, this is going to become a less secure source of revenue. It remains an important source of revenue amongst the metros. So I do think that this is going to have to be looked at. And, we did look at it in some detail in that National Treasury review, which is, say, 15 years ago. And this local business tax came onto the agenda. It was, in fact, supported by the FFC. But at the time, Pravin Gordhan was the minister. He decided he didn't want to take it further. So that's an important issue to look at again. Once again, what we're talking about here has to be thought of asymmetrically. It's going to be a useful source of revenue for the metros and the bigger Bs, but for most of the country, local revenue sources of this kind are not really going to deliver much revenue. So getting the grant system right in that context, absolutely crucial. But those were just quick comments and responses. Thank you so much. This has been a really good meeting so far, and thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you so much, Philip. Always fascinating listening to you. It's good to hear that that transport bill is coming back from the president. I remember us sitting in Parliament, two of us trying to make the argument with the parliamentary law advisors that what they were doing is unconstitutional. And I remember feeling quite despondent with their absolute refusal to acknowledge that they were doing something unconstitutional. It's good to hear that at least the presidency has now expressed reservations about the bill, because I think it points to the battle sometimes that local government has, convincing the rest of government about how it works and how the constitution works and what the status of local government is, and how sectors, I think Tania also made the point, how sectors are taking decisions within their sectoral thinking that really is sometimes fundamentally at odds with the vision of the constitution and what we want for local government. So thanks for those inputs. On the coalitions, by the way, I think spot on. Just to note that the Institute is seized with the issue. We've actually produced a coalitions framework, a framework for coalitions that we are producing together with SALGA, and hopefully we'll be able to come out with that within this week, giving hopefully some guidance on how these coalitions are going to be structured. And I completely agree with you that they are potentially good. We see them as fundamentally negative because they've caused so much instability, but because they're not managed well. And across the country, we see these coalitions go sour, but there's evidence from all around the world that coalitions actually produce more policy stability than majority governments. So very, very interesting argument there, and hopefully we can make a contribution there. Let's go over to Albertus Joubert, who had his hand up just for his inputs, and then we'll start wrapping up after that. Albertus, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, I'm sticking my hand lowered. Can everybody hear me? Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. Listen. Yes, I'm going to be quick because I think we might actually need a whole separate session on the salary one. Now, one of the things with the bigger municipalities is then obviously for the same job you get paid more. So I worked for a small rural municipality as a senior accountant, Basically, a junior accounting lecturer at UCT got paid a lot more than I did. I actually considered applying, but then decided, no, I can't work with students. But part of the problem is not actually the salary on the finance department. The problem is there may need to be a whole rethink about the salary structures in municipalities, in the sense that the rural municipalities, but even the city of Cape Town, even people at George Municipality have told me, you are struggling to get your technical department vacancy filling. I'm talking about electricians, plumbers, engineers, those type of people. So I think that's perhaps just something that the institute might consider for another time. Thank you, Chair.
Fantastic. No, very good point, Albertus. Thanks for bringing that in. So I think let's start wrapping up, because I think we all have other urgencies to attend to, and we want to get back to the election results and see what's happening. But let me hand over to Stephen and Tania just for their comments, and maybe on those issues that I mentioned. If they've got anything that they want to contribute further on the points that I raised earlier, please feel free to do so. Can we start with you, Stephen?
Sure, that's fine. Can you hear me this time?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, on the question around the greater devolution of functions, I think absolutely, and as several people have said, in an asymmetric fashion. I think there's often in South Africa a kind of status quo bias, where we know how things are done and how the arrangement is, that we know the history of how it got to be here, and there's a lot of scope. You know, transport, electricity have been raised in the chat as good examples, where there are clear benefits potentially to devolving things. There are a lot of, in the space of unfunded mandates that was mentioned earlier, there's a lot of kind of functional clearing out that needs to be done. Some things are kind of half with one sphere and half with another, and a reconfiguration is needed. And I think we're often shy to get into the nitty-gritty of that, because it's going to take 3-5 years to actually clear these things out. But if you've got something that's going to take that long, the best time to start, right, is yesterday. So that would be my comment on those things. Billing problems, I mean, everyone has billing problems. It's just the scale of the problems, and again, the willingness to get into the nitty-gritty. So we've got some colleagues in the provincial treasury, I'm not sure if they're on the call, who sit with municipalities and go through line by line on bills, you know, including to government, particularly with government departments, because there are always confusions about property ownership, etc. So there are always going to be problems like that. The question is, are you going through them and solving those problems, or are you just allowing them to accumulate and become kind of, and go from exceptions to systemic problems? And I think that's what happens too often in the billing space. On the impact of the local government equitable share, yeah, I mean, the equitable share has significantly increased transfers to many rural municipalities. As I said, I think that often hasn't been the blessing that we hoped for. I tell people sometimes it's the single biggest regret of my career. You know, I was when I was starting out in intergovernmental relations in the National Treasury, I was running the review of the local government equitable share formula, and I thought I'd done a really good thing because the new formula shifted a lot of money towards poor rural municipalities. And in my mind, I thought I was getting more money to poor rural people. And I realized that was unfortunately a category error, that moving the money to the municipalities didn't mean that it necessarily benefited the people. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done in between those two things to make the system work. And I'm confident that my colleagues at National Treasury now will do a much better and smarter job on the next round with the equitable share. On the development charges, I think National Treasury would have to answer that. There is a draft bill out And lastly, just on the comments on the property rates and the local business tax, etc. I mean, I'm just excited that we're having that discussion here, because I think too often that's left out of the discussion is those local government tax powers. Yeah, there are disadvantages to the property rates, there are advantages, but let's have that discussion and let's make reforms in that space where there are problems and where there is potential. I think that's really exciting, because I think that in discussions of the local government fiscal framework, you start with a framework that maybe in somebody's head in 1998 it was going to be 90% own revenue funded. Now it's 75% own revenue funded in practice. But we always end up talking about that 25% that is in the transfers. And we always end up arguing that that transfers portion needs to become bigger. And to me, it's just flogging a dead horse, because it's not plausible that that's going to save local government. You can tinker at the margins, and for some rural municipalities, and especially small municipalities where, as Albertus has pointed out, the regulatory burdens really impose a tough staffing constraint on people, etc. You know, there are genuine things that need to be solved in the transfer system. I don't want to take away from the importance of working on improving the transfer system, but systemically, that's never going to be the solution in local government. Local government works best where it's own revenue funded. It has that additional accountability. And I'm excited that today we got a little bit more into the discussion about some of the nuances of that. I think that's really exciting. So thanks for providing that platform. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think very well noted. I think those very important points about bringing it back to the own revenue discussion. Just two quick points. Sandra is responding on the Municipal Functions and Powers Bill, saying that it has been presented to several clusters and hopefully will be submitted to Parliament in 2022. So that's good news that there is momentum on the processing of that bill. So thanks for that input, Sandra. Just also quickly on the issue of regulatory burdens, on the back of what Albertus mentioned, and Stephen, you picked up on it. So we're hosting a webinar on that next week. Invites will go out very quickly, probably today or tomorrow, where we want to discuss that in a bit more detail, you know, how to streamline and look at the regulatory burden on local government, which really is one of the, I think, sort of common complaints across all municipalities of how hard it sometimes is to work within a very tight legal framework with so many of these. I think Tania put it fantastically when she said these aggregates are imposed on local government, aggregates in terms of the wage bill, so many other factors that play down into local government, and local government doesn't have a choice but to comply, but to adhere to it, and that it has had a cost to it, which we'll discuss next week. So I think we are getting towards the end of it, and of course I want to end off with a final word from Tania, after which I'll close the session. Over to you, Tania.
Thanks, Jaap, and I agree with most of what Steve put on the table. So I want to say that, you know, if I were king, when I could make edicts, I would actually increase the transfers to local government to ensure that basic services are provided. But if I look at the political economy, it's more sexy for politicians to create new entitlements, but there's no new money, right? At the end of the day, aggregates are enforced. So that means that we have a system that will basically rob Peter to pay Paul. So if you get a basic income grant, it's not a victory because something will be taken away elsewhere, right? And because of that, municipalities really are on their own. They have to ask, what can they do to move forward? And I'm not sure that the new political incumbents actually understand that, number one. Number two, you know, Steve also talked about the budget forum. They're going through this whole process to rethink where we are. But who actually knows about this process? I mean, what does civil society know about it? When it gets to Parliament, the parliamentary approval process is so rushed. The deadlines are so tight, it will actually never be discussed. And at the end of the day, individual municipalities' voices are not adequately heard in that whole process, given that how this impacts on individual municipalities can vary because the context varies so markedly, across provinces. So I think that we need to think a bit more about how we open up this dialogue. I know it's not sexy. Maybe basic income grant is more sexy. You can write papers, you can get grants for it. But this is absolutely fundamental because it's not only an equity issue, it's an economic growth issue. And unless we deal with economic growth issues, we are actually shortchanging the future. So, we really need to have a look at that. I want to address the issue on the conditional grants. And maybe I didn't understand the person's point, so they can correct me. But my understanding of the question was, perhaps we should be moving towards tighter conditional grants linked to delivery areas, right? So in other words, less unconditional grants. Would that move us into a better space? So I just want to make two comments. One is the constitutionality of that, right? Once you make more and more of the funds to local government conditional, then it becomes less and less constitutional, right? Okay, because for better or for worse, our constitution has framed local government as a separate, independent sphere. But let's keep the conditionality aside. Okay, let's say we did it for practical reasons. We are then saying that accountability must be upwards to national departments, rather than local communities. Now, is that likely to be more effective? Quite frankly, when I look at the oversight capability of national departments and other entities over local government, I don't see capacity there. Right? We talk about lack of capacity at municipal level, but there's equally a lack of capacity at national level. So I'm not convinced that doing that will actually solve our problem. But you know what? Maybe in certain sectors it could work, right? But you need to use a nuanced sector-based approach. I don't think you can come with kind of a general statement there. And then on development charges, I think that, the municipalities that we spoke to in the Western Cape, they said, well, but we've always had development charges, right? So maybe the rest of the country hasn't been using those development charges, but there hasn't been anything in the legislation to really prevent them from doing it. I think that what the legislation will do is just improve consistency. So if you didn't have the political will or the capacity to do it before the legislation, how are you going to develop that after the legislation, right? Secondly, these development charges don't really give you additional unencumbered discretionary revenue that you can use for other things, right? They just recover costs on costs which the municipality bore on behalf of developers, right? So you could argue that money is fungible, so they free up revenues, from other sources. But I don't think that that's going to be terribly significant. I think it's important that we have the principle, right? But it's not going to really drastically change things. I do think that the issue of oversight tools is really critical, right? If you look at interventions, do they actually work, right? Now, for me, I think an intervention can work if there's an issue of bad management, right? Lack of fiscal effort. But when the problem is fiscal capacity, right? In other words, the best management in the world could not have improved your sustainability, right? Even if you applied maximum fiscal effort, then how useful is that as an instrument, right? And then one of the municipalities in our sample was Kannaland Municipality, where the municipality wanted to spend more than half their budget on unsolicited bid for renewable energy. And then you think, okay, that council clearly cannot understand or will not understand that it's not sustainable. They are overriding probably the officials, they're overriding the administrator that was trying to make you know, if you look at the numbers, you see an improvement until that point. So the question is, you know, what are these oversight mechanisms, and how do you introduce these oversight mechanisms without relegating, you know, council and the local community, you know, just to bystanders? Because at the end of the day, this is the heart of local governance, and I don't think that we've really grappled well with those issues. And then, you know, there was also an issue about gentrification, you know, in the context of workup and property rights revenues. And, you know, while I agree that there is opportunity to exploit property rights revenues, you will always have this issue. It's normally in the context of pensioners where wealth increases, at least on paper, you know, because of property valuations increasing. But the income of the recipients don't necessarily speak to that. And to me, at the end of the day, it comes down to a political choice, right? If you look at France, they've taken decisions, you know, to try and preserve communities, etc. Right? Okay. Obviously, there's a cost to that. That cost needs to be quantified. It doesn't come for free, right? But it also speaks to the political choices that we make around property rates. And the issue is, how do you target those who can pay, and what sort of decisions do you take, you know, in respect of equity, you know, preservation of communities, etc., right? Because communities are not just physical places, you know, they're the people that are there, you know, those are the way, you know, culture is captured. So just some of my thoughts, and I'll hand back to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tania. So this has been really a fascinating webinar. I really enjoyed being part of this and sharing it. I learned so much. So this also for me has been extremely useful. Thanks to Tania for the excellent research that underpins all of this, and there's more to come. So please stay tuned for the upcoming webinars. Thanks again to Stephen for joining us at short notice and giving such an excellent and valuable input, really sort of pointing us also in a few other directions. So I think it's been very, really useful. Thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks to our sponsors, our funders, the Hanns Seidel Foundation. Really grateful to them for making all of this possible. We will do our best to disseminate all the information, the slides, the recording will be made available. Please, if you haven't done so yet, please fill out that little evaluation form if you don't mind. And apologies if we didn't get to all the questions and all the inputs. It was really interesting to see the chat box come to life and so many valuable inputs shared there. So thanks very much for that. And apologies if we couldn't get to your question. Thanks so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll hope to see each other soon again. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.